All right, so this is going to be a quick overview of the first unit for lab. As you can see, this first page is just sort of the cover page for lab, and then kind of a table of contents of how the semester will go or the session will go in regards to what we're going to be looking at. For now, obviously, we are just focusing on lab unit 1. Cardiovascular system, so that's what we'll look at, but then we'll do respiratory in lab unit 2, digestion primary in lab unit 3, and then in lab unit 4 we'll have urinary and reproductive. There are some limitations, obviously, with doing this online. We're not going to be using models and dissections and things like that, so that's a little bit different. So I kind of wanted just to kind of explain how it's going to go and what to expect, and to help you kind of prepare how you're going to go about your preparations for the lab practical exam. So let's go ahead and take a look then at lab unit 1. What we're going to be looking at in this first unit, what you're going to be responsible for identifying are things related to hematology, which is essentially different types of formed elements, primarily is what you'll be identifying, and then some features about them, like the percentages you typically see in the blood of these different types of cells. We'll be looking at the heart anatomy. All images will not be doing a dissection, although I've embedded a video of a dissection. If you want to watch that, you're welcome to kind of see what that's like, but I won't be testing you on a dissection. And then finally, we'll be doing EKG, where really it's understanding, I go over a lot of this in the lecture, but it's understanding the different waveforms and their significance and being able to correctly identify different waveforms. All right, so the first part of this then is hematology, which, as I said, is really a study of blood. What we'll be looking at more are different blood cells. So these first few slides here are really just sort of background information for you that I go over in lectures. So make sure you have an understanding of, physical characteristics of blood. You'll need that for lecture as well. So that's just good information to have. The different percentages of the formed elements versus plasma. And then what we're going to be testing you on are identifying the different types of formed elements. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So red blood cells, you want to be able to identify them. These should be pretty straightforward. They're the most common type of cell you're going to see, right? 99.9% of all formed elements are red blood cells in terms of what they look like. That's an illustration, but to test you on this, I would use an image like this, where you'd have to, I'd say what type of cells are these, and you'd say obviously red blood cells for this one. But then you also want to have different information like the percentages found in blood of red blood cells, which I already talked about. Features, like what they do primarily, obviously, is bind oxygen, CO2, etc. So this is just an overview of blood cell formation, which is a good slide just to generally have information. Also allows you to review the different types of formed elements, red blood cells, platelets, and the different white blood cells. And then again, as I said, here is a nice sort of overview of the abundance, appearance, functions, and remarks for red blood cells. White blood cells, a little bit different. These do not have, they don't bind oxygen. Obviously, these are involved more in defense and removal of toxins and attacking abnormal cells. So a little bit different in terms of their appearance. They do have a nuclei, another organelle, unlike red blood cells that do not have a nuclei. And so what you're going to be doing is identifying the different types of white blood cells. There are 5 different types of white blood cells. And most of our white blood cells are actually not in our blood. You have very small percentages of white blood cells in our blood, as most of the formed elements, as I said, in our blood are dedicated to red blood cells. All right, so there are 5 different types of white blood cells you have to identify: neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. And essentially, I'll use these pictures here for you to identify each one. You can see all 5 of them right there. And that's how I'll test you on these white blood cells. So for instance, the first one is a neutrophil, right? It looks like this. So if I show you that image, you have to correctly tell me that that is a neutrophil. But then also you want to give me the information listed here, in terms of the percentages you typically see, 50 to 7%, the appearance, other functions like their engulfing pathogens, et cetera. Want to have that information so that I can ask you, about those different features. So that's fair game for neutrophils. And then, as I said, you pretty much just rinse and repeat for the other 4 blood cells. You need to be able to correctly identify it from a picture, right? And then you also need to give me any relevant information from the percentages to other features and functions and appearances to give me any of that information. All right, so that's how you're going to do the white blood cells. You just continue on through basophils in terms of correctly identifying them, monocytes, and lymphocytes, which you can see right there. All right, so that's what you're going to be looking at. This is just sort of a comparison with, as it relates to leukemia. That's more of a lecture topic that we go over in the lecture slides. And then here's, again, a nice summary of all the different white blood cells in terms of their appearance, the abundance, and other functions and remarks. These can be very useful in terms of reviewing for that material. So there you see all 5 of those. So I included those. Now, what we would have done in class is this human blood smear slide activity. Obviously, we're not going to be able to do that. So I'm not going to be testing you on that, but what I will be testing you on as it relates to the different blood cells are being able to visually correctly identify them and then give me, functions and percentages and other information related to each blood cell. All right. All right, so that's it for blood cells. Hopefully I made that clear in terms of how I'm going to test you on that. Next is the heart anatomy. And again, typically we do a dissection to go with the heart models that you look at, and for this we'll just be looking at images that I've displayed here. Okay, and so this is information about the heart, is generally background, but again, good information to have. You'll need it for both lecture and lab. And then what you want to do then is to be successfully identify the structures, and it says it on the lab manual. Identify the following surface features on heart models, pictures. And so the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and identify these structures, and I've included pictures for you to identify these. So this is an anterior view, and you can see, so I would use a picture like this, obviously that's unlabeled on the exam for you to identify different features. And then here's a posterior view of surface features. So I could use a picture like this on the exam as well for you to identify those features, or those sites. Then you want to identify the coronary vessels. Coronary vessels are blood vessels that actually deliver oxygen nutrients to the heart itself. And so you can see all these are that I want you to be able to identify on the model listed there. And then I would use pictures like this one is a great picture here that I could use on the exam. That's an anterior view of the vessels. Here's a nice posterior view of the vessels. I'm going to make sure you have that one. This would be another one that I could use for identifying vessels. Then we wanted to look at the internal structure. So this requires basically a sagittal section or not a sagittal, frontal section of the heart, so you can identify these structures, and so you can see all those things that are listed here that you want to identify on these pictures. And so this is one that will definitely be in the exam right here. You can see all these things that are labeled. Obviously, in exam, I would use an unlabeled image for you to identify those things. Here's another image where you can see this is actual frontal section. You can see those, use that. And then you want to make sure you have a good understanding of the different heart valves. I talk a lot about these in the lecture. So the tricuspid and bicuspid and the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves as well, and be able to identify those. And so we have some nice pictures here of the different valves as well. as seen on these different images that I've included. All right, there's another one, and then there's the last one. All right, so as I said, I've included sheep heart dissection video embedded in the presentation. So if you're in PowerPoint, slide presentation view, and you click on that sheep heart dissection, it'll take you to a YouTube video, or you can peruse that. But I'm not going to be testing on an actual dissected heart, but it could be useful for you to help you master all this information to see that as well. Again, this is a lab assignment we would have done related to sheep heart dissection, where you actually would have dissected an actual sheep heart and you would have looked at all the different features and structures. But again, with the nature of things, and not being able to do lab in person, this is sort of the best we can do for now. All right, and then finally, the last part is EKG, electrocardiogram pulse. So again, I've included just some general background information, so you definitely want to have all this so you understand, the electrical pathways of the heart and how that works. So these first two slides sort of give general review of, how this system works. Again, I talk a lot about this in lecture as well on the YouTube channel. So make sure you watch those and sort of are able to put it all together. But what I'll be testing you on is identifying the different waveforms and their significance. For instance, I'll have a EKG strip on the exam, and say I've highlighted, one of these right here. Well, that happens to be a P wave. And P wave, you have to A, be able to correctly identify which waveform it is, and then B, the significance, meaning what is happening in that time. As you can see here, a P wave represents a depolarization of the atria. So you need to be able to correctly identify all the different waveforms and intervals as well, and the significance of these intervals. And so there's some other information over here on the side of different intervals. And again, I go over these EKG strips in detail in the lecture, so make sure you review all those in the lecture and sort of coordinate it with what I'll be asking you. So for instance, on the exam, I may have a strip like this out and highlight, like this section here, and I'd say identify this waveform. And that, of course, is a QRS complex, and it represents the depolarization of the ventricles, right? So I could ask you those types of related to that. And then, another, like highlight this one. What is this waveform? And you'd say T wave. What's the significance? That's the repolarization of the ventricles, etc. So all that information is in the lab for you and be able to identify those. But again, this slide here really summarizes nicely sort of all the different waveforms and their significance going forward. All right, so then in class, you would have actually had the opportunity to hook yourself up to leads and see your heart, in a normal cardiac sinus rhythm. But again, with the limitations in the class, we won't be able to do that. But that's how I'll test you on the EKG stuff, is have you correctly identify the different waveforms and then also be able to give me the significance of those waveforms. All right, so that's it. That's the last slide. So hopefully this gives you a nice overview of how to go about preparing for the exam. And so that's it. I'll try to do one of these for each lab as we roll through these, just to give you kind of an overview, although I think they're pretty straightforward and pretty self-explanatory from that standpoint. All right. Well, hopefully that was useful, and that's it.